Good morning, everybody. Once again, I'm State Senator Mike Simmons from the 7th District, which includes Rogers Park, Edgewater, Good morning, everybody. Once again, I'm State Senator Mike Simmons from the 7th District, which includes Rogers Park, Edgewater, Uptown, Lincoln Square, and Westridge and North Center. I speak to you today as not just an elected official that represents this community, but also as a community member, as somebody who understands what this struggle has meant for our society, our city, our state, and our country for a long time. It is so important that in a district like mine, one of the most diverse districts in the state, if not the country, where we have Indigenous Americans, we have Black Americans, we have white people that just got here and that have been here for 300 years, that we talk about what this day means for our Indigenous siblings. Because as a state legislator, I did what I needed to do in terms of supporting the effort to establish a statewide holiday to acknowledge Indigenous people and the history that they have endured, and frankly to talk about the redemption that needs to happen in the decades and the years ahead. But as a community member, I'm also really interested in talking about what that redemption looks like. What does it mean to reimagine what justice looks like for Indigenous people? And we could talk about this as something for the entire country, but as a Chicagoan, and as somebody that's a fourth-generation Chicagoan, I'm really interested in talking about what does that look like right here in this city? What does that look like right here in Cook County? It does mean having an Indigenous Day that is celebrated on October 10th every year instead of Columbus Day. It is talking about celebrating Indigenous Day at the county-wide level, because when we talk about those societies that lived here for hundreds and thousands of years, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Miami, and all of the Native Americans that unfortunately so many of us are not taught about in our schools, it's important to talk about that history of erasure. It's to talk about that history of physical violence and systemic violence that still rears its head on this community. And then it's important to us as elected officials and as community members and as justice-loving people, like so many of us in the district I represent are, to talk about what does it mean to actually have redemption for those communities. Is it just celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, or is it looking at how we talk about the history of Indigenous people in our schools? Is it as somebody that represents Indigenous people? Because people always talk about Native Americans like they're no longer here, and they still are here. They're my constituents. They live in Lincoln Square, they live in Budlong Woods, they live in Uptown, and they've been living in Uptown. They live in Edgewater, they live in Rogers Park, they live all across Chicago. We have to talk about that systemic violence, those incarceration rates, those literacy rates, the whole dispossession around housing policy, and what so many of our Indigenous siblings have suffered for decades and decades since 1837. That's what having an Indigenous Peoples Day is all about. It gives us that time to reflect on that history and to talk about what it's had actually done to our communities. And then those of us that are more hopeful and that are more justice-loving, and certainly myself as somebody who's half Ethiopian American, so one half of my family, we just got here, and the other half of my family, I'm descendant of Black American slaves that were captive and brought here against their will. You better believe I'm really interested and fully invested in talking about what justice means for my Indigenous siblings. And I know there's so many people here from all racial backgrounds that share that basic commitment to social justice. So what I want to ask you to do as a state senator for the 7th District, and more importantly as a member of this community, to think about what does that reimagining of justice mean for our Indigenous communities. Reimagine that, what that reckoning can look like. What does it look like at a governmental level? What does it look like at a policy level? And what does it look like as a day-to-day, neighbor-to-neighbor level? For us to reimagine that history and to actually do the right thing, so that 100 years from now and 200 years from now, everybody knows that Rogers Avenue, which is right here to our left, was the Indian boundary line created by the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804, which dispossessed Native American communities from much of what we now know as Chicago. Rogers Avenue is right here in our district. The community area that we're in is named for this street. Everyone should know that this was the Indian boundary line just 100 and some odd years ago. And we should talk about what this street can mean for justice and for reimagining what liberation could look like in the years ahead. It's a good place to start. So thank you so much for being here this morning, everybody. I'm honored that there are folks here that took the time to come and to stand with our Indigenous siblings and say that we see you, we hear you, and it's our responsibility as your siblings to talk about what justice is going to look like in our lifetimes and for the generations that come ahead. Thank you so much.